welcome to another episode of Command Combat Battle Reports. Today we are doing a board game reenactment of the Battle of Fredericksburg, because today is the 150th anniversary of the battle. It actually took place over 3 days, December 11, 12, and 13. But the main part of the battle took place on December 13th. The 11 and 12th were mostly about trying to cross this river, the Rappahannock, across a bridge that they constructed, and then there's the town of Fredericksburg. Essentially, they were trying to steal a march on Lee by getting in behind him, and had they gotten through quick enough, they would have stolen that march, and they would have maybe gotten in behind him. And they could have possibly even surprised them, but because of politics and because of essentially just the snow and slow speed of everything, they didn't quite get what they needed in time, and so by the time they got everything over there, Lee was already in position here at Marie's Heights. He had a bunch of infantry, actually 7 men deep, meaning 1 man at the front and 6 behind him, behind this stone wall. It was a natural wall that was there. They didn't even need to do much to it to make it just like impenetrable. Just behind that stone wall was this line of hills called Marie's Heights. If you ever see it, it's just perfect for artillery. You could literally layer it on top of one another. They just had lines and lines of artillery aimed right across that field at Fredericksburg, so if they went across that big open field, they would just be slaughtered. So, initially, wisely so, the Federals pushed out to be, sort of across. They didn't have a lot in the wide open center for fear they might get hit, but they had a lot of guys who had crossed over further downriver and were over here on the right. Now, they had 3 what was called grand divisions. They had one under Sumner, that was here, and it represented here with him. One that was under Hooker, who was here, and one that was under Franklin, who was here, way over on their left flank. The Confederates were under 2 corps, which is Longstreet over here, and Jackson over here. And Lee was up here on Marie's Heights along with Longstreet. They were essentially, looking down on the whole battlefield and basically waiting to see what would happen, how they would basically come and attack them. The Federals so outnumbered them. When I say 3 grand divisions, I mean the grand divisions having several corps within each one of them. So they had 2 or 3 corps, I believe, in each grand division. So you calculate that among 3 grand divisions versus 2 Confederate corps, and that was all they could muster up. So the Confederates were really outnumbered, but they had an amazing defensive position. The Federals were really going to have, a hard time, getting this one. And it was in December, so there's snow on the ground, it's hard to move, but they went ahead and tried to attack anyway. The beginning of it, actually in the morning, just when it was starting, it was foggy out, people could hardly see each other, so they just moved forward in the fog, sort of blindly. So it was about 8:30 that the Union attack began over here on their left. It's all right because we're looking from the Confederate point of view. But it was sent forward to 3 divisions. Franklin was supposed to send forward a division to lead and others to support. He chose the smallest one under George Meade, which is going to be represented here. He was supposed to be supported by Birney on one side and Gibbon on the other. And essentially he was going to try to go forward and take some hill and woods areas to kind of sweep around the Confederates. Seemed like a pretty decent plan. They were moving forward, but they didn't count on this. So one very bold horse artillery unit under Pelham. He was only 24 years old and, very bold, and he just ran up his artillery up on that hill and was just picking people off, despite the fact that the Federals were hitting with artillery, infantry fire, just everything kind of hitting them. And Lee even watched from way over here on Marie's Heights. He was very impressed with this young man who just held his ground despite thousands of people coming at him. And finally, after there was enough gunfire, he had to pull down. Even Stuart, who was a very bold cavalry commander who was nearby, was sort of advising maybe he should get down, but he just kind of stayed up there until finally he had to go. He was under Jackson, who was close by, and Jackson kind of expected a lot from people, and so that was probably his reasoning. So by 10 o'clock, the Union was making some pretty good progress over here on their left. Again, our right, we're looking from the Confederate point of view. The Confederates had thought they built up a good defensive position, but they had kind of a gap in the middle, and Meade made sure to exploit it. He ran in there, started hitting some of A.P. Hill's men on the flank. It was A.P. Hill that was supposed to be holding this position, and he was doing his best, but he really didn't have a lot. Gibbon was indeed supporting him, although Meade was doing most of the work. Birney, meanwhile, got slowed down by other means. I have it represented here with the cavalry, because that was one of the things. Stuart kept kind of harassing his lines, but he had a lot of other kind of things that kind of slowed him down. He wasn't taking a lot of losses. Meade was losing a lot. Gibbon was starting to lose quite a bit at this time, but they were starting to make a breakthrough, so it was starting to look good over on this side. This was about the same time that the assault was starting to get underway over on this side, which is the most famous part of it, but I think that Sumner hesitated because he knew what a ridiculous idea it was to try to go across this big open field with all that artillery and infantry watching him. So by late morning, even though Meade had been pushing forward pretty steadily and been doing quite a good job leading this assault, his men were exhausted, and many weren't even alive anymore. He had lost quite a few, and Gibbon was starting to wear out and everything, and the Confederates then brought in D.H. Hill and Taliaferro to plug the gap and were, holding him off. They were really kind of struggling at this point, and it was pretty clear that it wasn't going to be able to continue. Meade had finally gotten Birney up there. Birney had been slow to get up there, but it wasn't quite enough. They weren't going to be able to use him quite so well. So the assault really slowed and even started to be pushed back the other way as the Confederates began to counterattack on this side. This was about the time when the first assault was beginning across this big open field towards here. They were supposed to start at about 11. They got started late morning, closer to about noon. So by noon, this flank was pretty well decided. Meade at one point had a gap to break through and had called for the reinforcements to exploit it. Unfortunately, they didn't get there in time. Birney had been slowed up by other problems, and there were supposed to be other reinforcements coming from Burnside that didn't, and so they wound up just being continuously pushed back. The Confederates did a counterattack, this being Jackson. Of course, he is going to be very aggressive and was starting to push through. This was the one thing that was an advantage of Birney having been slowed up, because his troops were still pretty well fresh, and they stopped the counterattack from happening and them being able to go up and really finish them off. Jackson wanted to keep on pushing, but because of those fresh troops and because this artillery just kept hitting him, he really wasn't able to do anything much more on this side. So the battle really shifted over to here, which is the infamous part of this battle. So what can be said about this just horrendous slaughter? You can kind of see essentially what happened. They went across this big open field towards an entrenched position behind a stone wall with artillery on the hills behind it. The men just got slaughtered. This is one of the most one-sided fights in military history, really. They not only was it a big open field to have to go across, but they also had obstacles in the way. They had fences and fields that were, farmers' fields, that sort of thing, that they had to kind of go through a lot of obstacles, and you always go as slow as your slowest man, so they were going pretty slow. The worst of it was a creek that they had to go across that had a real deep dip in it, and so they had to go across these planks to get across, which meant the men had to line up at one specific spot in this field that the Confederates already knew, had already had paced out, so they knew exactly how far they had to shoot to take them out at that position, at pretty much any position. This was field the Confederates knew. It wasn't just neutral ground, so they had everything lined up as to exactly how far they needed to shoot, and so their fire was very, very accurate. Lee was even moved from Marie's Heights. He couldn't believe, first of all, they had tried that. He had just created that defensive position as a place of, a block, and okay, no, you cannot come this way. So when they actually tried it, and the men, the Union men, much to their credit, or somewhat to their credit, continued to go across there. I guess I should say, very much to their credit, being brave, but at the same time, it's one of those things where, you had to know there's no way you're going to get across that. And so Lee was very moved, and he wound up saying, "It is well that war is so terrible, we should grow too fond of it." This is where he said that famous quote. One can debate what exactly he meant by that, but I always got the idea he was kind of moved by the bravery of the federal men, despite their commanders just ordering them to do a horribly stupid thing. They went down by the thousands. It was just a horrendous slaughter here. Um, there was one particular point where the Irish Brigade, the Union Irish Brigade, charged at a very specific point, and the Confederate brigade that shot them down happened to be Irish as well. It was sort of their Confederate Irish Brigade. So this is it about 12:30, between noon and 1. The charge really started about noon and got pretty well hammered by 1. By the early afternoon, the Union charge was just being completely repulsed. What few people were still alive were usually pulling back. A few of them kind of got a little bit close, but really most of them were either captured or killed, being shot down by almost machine gun fire because of the fact that they had 6 men loading to 1 man firing at the wall, plus all the canister from the artillery. There was one, I believe it was a brigade, it might have been a little bit more, but one group that managed to get around the flank and did a little bit of damage to the Confederates, but they really didn't have a lot of room. Right off the board there is pretty much where it becomes swampy, and then the river, and they just really couldn't get around it, couldn't maneuver very much, and they got pretty quickly repulsed and sent back. Now, you would think that after such a horrible and one-sided slaughter that the Union commander would learn his lesson and go, okay, let's limp back across and get into a defensive position or something, but no. He actually decided to double down, and he ordered General Hooker to send his corps in next. Oh, I'm sorry, his Grand Division in next, which consisted of several corps. He had already slaughtered several corps with sending in one Grand Division, and now he wanted to do it with another one. Hooker decided to do something very odd. He decided to go take a look and maybe see for himself what the situation was like. Oh, how bizarre it was to actually do some reconnaissance. And he saw what an impossible and ridiculous situation was. And he saw that even the men who had gone out there now, the survivors, were hiding behind a wall. It was a wall of their own dead that was on the field. There were so many people killed that they had literally created an entire wall. And so the men who were still on the field were hiding behind that. Hooker looked at that and went, no, not a good idea. He went to Burnside and he said, hey, he told him the situation, and Burnside still was like, no, let's go. We're gonna, he just kept insisting that they would do this attack and that somehow they would prevail. So Hooker, after not being able to convince him not to do it, by about 4 o'clock realized he's actually going to have to do this idiotic thing, even though the day is almost done and, well, it's impossible. And it led to pretty predictable results once again. The men were slaughtered. There were a total of about 14 charges, usually individual brigades going in. You'd usually want to send in a whole division if you're going to do some kind of assault at all, let alone something like this. But they were scattered because of all the obstacles in the way, and they wound up having around 14 charges. They took between 6,000 and 8,000 casualties, and none of the charges succeeded. Burnside even offered to lead the last charge himself while crying, openly weeping, because he finally realized, what he had sent his men to do. And, you have to give him credit for being so brave to do it, but there was just no way they were going to do it, and it was just just one of the biggest blunders in the history of warfare. So when the sun went down soon after, nobody had gained any ground. The Confederates had held their ground, which is all they wanted to do, and the Federals had not managed to take any. Burnside had completely failed and lost a huge amount of his army in the process. He did call for one more charge from Franklin over on their left, which is our right, because we're watching from this side. But Franklin told him that he really didn't have anybody who could do it anymore, which wasn't entirely true. He still had one more corps, but who knows why he didn't. There was never really explained. It could have been because he saw the ridiculous slaughter that was happening on the other side, or he knew that really the time to do it would have been earlier. But for whatever reason, he didn't attack. The battle ended like this. There was nothing at all gained. There was just this wall of dead over on this side, and to which the Federals pretty much hid behind that night and some of the next few days, as they just sort of took pot shots at each other. And a few days later, they just crawled back across that bridge and tried to march around another way to get across the river, but that became known as the famous Mud March because it was so muddy that they just couldn't maneuver. And that was pretty much Burnside's leadership, the end of his being in charge of an army. So that about covers the Battle of Fredericksburg. I know there's a lot of other details. You can talk about it in the comments section. I was just trying to give a basic overview. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to subscribe and check us out on commandcombatreports.com. Happy gaming, everybody.